Thank you.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I listened to the new Prime Minister's speech this morning, and he promised to fix mistakes and acknowledged that work was needed to restore trust in the government. And he said that it would be a government marked by integrity, professionalism and accountability. But the problem with this bill is that it hugely removes the accountability of the executive to Parliament. And I really do believe that it is one of the mistakes which need to be fixed by the new Prime Minister. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is prompted by ideology, a desperation to point to some so-called Brexit benefits. But there's an overwhelming body of opinion from business to the trade unions which say that this bill is a mess and it will lead to legal uncertainty and more chaos. The author of the bill has gone, and I think this bill should go with him. Let's make no bones about it. The departing Prime Minister has left an almighty mess behind her because she pursued an economic policy which the vast majority of people, including the incoming Prime Minister, advised her against. This is a bill which the vast majority of people, including the majority of parties in this House, business, the trade unions, legal experts, all sorts of third sector bodies and the devolved governments are advising against. So my plea to the Minister, and most particularly to the Prime Minister, given the promises he made this morning, is do not make the same mistake with this bill that your predecessor made with the economy. Now, there are so many problems with this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's hard to know where to start, and other honourable members have outlined some of them. I've got 7 problems I want to raise. The first one is that the bill represents a huge transfer of power from Parliament to the executive, and that is hardly taking back control. Taking back control was supposed to be about the people of the United Kingdom and this Parliament, not about the executive. And it gives ministers incredible powers to legislate on areas which affect our everyday lives without really any meaningful democratic input. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that this bill means that if ministers want retained EU law to fall away, they needn't take any action at all. The decision to take no action is not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And that means that very important rights and protections could be lost, including the right to equal pay as between men and women, a pivotal changing right in our society, including food safety standards, as others have talked about, and also including other workers' rights, such as the right to a certain amount of paid holiday per year and the 48-hour maximum working week for road hauliers. These are not the sort of rights that should just fall away, perhaps even by accident. Third problem. As I said in my intervention at the beginning of this debate, far from creating new high standards in our regulatory frameworks, the replacement legislation cannot increase standards. It can only leave them as they are or make them lower. And that's what clause 15.5 says. Well, the Minister's shaking his head. That's what it says. In my opinion, that's what it says. Many other legal experts think that's what it says. It's not a minor detail, it's a major problem with the bill. Fourth problem, reducing standards or allowing key pieces of legislation to simply lapse could risk the UK's trading relationship with the EU at a time when we can ill afford it. Please, I know it was several Prime Ministers ago, but would the Government please remember the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and their obligations under it? Fifth problem, the proposed speed and scale of these changes. As we've heard, the Government's retained EU law dashboard includes over 2,400 pieces of legislation in 300 policy sectors, areas across 21 sectors of the UK. So the proposed speed and scale of these changes across such a huge area are completely unrealistic and inevitably will result in mistakes. The sixth point I want to make is the problems that this bill poses for the devolved settlement. Now, these were gone into by my honourable friend, the member for Argyll and Bute, in some detail, and I'm not, because of the constraints of time, I'm not going to go into them in the same detail. But the fact, I'll just finish my point and then I'll give way. The fact of the matter is that the bill in its current form will allow UK government ministers to act in policy areas that are devolved, and to do so without the consent of the Scottish ministers or our Parliament, because secondary legislation doesn't need consent. Madam Deputy Speaker, primary legislation needs consent, but that rule is more honoured in the breach than the observance. And I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. And as usual, she's making a forensic speech. She'll be interested to learn that recently in Cardiff, over 10,000 people marched for independence. I never thought that would ever happen in my lifetime. And that's happening because of bills like this. The people of Wales are seeing the British government supplanting the devolution settlement. And then they come into the conclusion, they've got two choices, direct Westminster control or independence. That's what's happening in Wales, and I'm sure that's what's happening in Scotland.
Yeah. Well, indeed, and I'm very pleased to say that I actually spent the weekend in Cardiff, my first ever visit to Cardiff, and I found it to be a very beautiful city, attending the Filia Feminist Conference, and I'll certainly be going back to Cardiff, and I'd quite like to go and join one of your independence marches sometime. But, you know, whether you are a unionist or a nationalist, the fact of the matter is the kind of mess that this bill is going to create is only going to cause more problems between Westminster and Holyrood. And that brings me to my seventh point, which is about Northern Ireland and the impact of this bill on the protocol. The government's not yet conducted a full and comprehensive assessment of retained EU law, and it's also failed to analyse which of the areas of retained EU law interact with or impact on its commitments made in Article 2(1) of the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, or indeed, as I indicated earlier, on the level playing field provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And the removal of key frameworks for interpreting retained EU laws and settlement agreement legislation, including EU general principles in Clause 5 and retained EU case law in Clause 7, may have an impact on the Protocol Article 2(2), which talks about keeping pace. So that's another area where the government really need to go back to the drawing board. Now, as Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, I can say we'll be scrutinising this bill very carefully for its rights implications and bringing forward amendments. But to be frank, I think the bill is pretty much beyond amendment, and it's a bill that needs to go back to the drawing board. And what I would say to the government in conclusion is, please do not pursue another dangerous ideological experiment at the cost of our constituents' rights and at the cost of our constituents' livelihoods. This is going to have a big impact on business and a big impact on workers' rights. This is absolutely not about people or this Parliament taking back control. It's about executive fiat and the sidelining of democratic scrutiny by this Parliament. Now, in his speech taking office this morning, the Prime Minister said he would put the country's needs above politics. Well, the country doesn't need this. And in actual fact, there's more than one country in our union. And the government needs to respect the wishes of Scotland's voters, the wishes of Welsh voters, and the wishes of Northern Ireland voters, as well as the devolved settlement. So my message to the government is this bill is a mess. Yes, it's embarrassing to ditch bills, but let's face it, the government's had a lot of embarrassment recently. They're getting used to it. They've already ditched one bill, the Bill of Rights, although I believe it might be bouncing back soon as a result of the Cabinet reshuffle. But it is possible to ditch a bill at this stage. This bill needs to be ditched, and the way in which we deal with retained EU law needs to be revisited completely. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
David Simmons.
Well, thank you.